PIDE is actively involved in looking at issues of development economics, as in the Pakistan economy, specifically in the Pakistan economy. It's an old institute that's been around since 1957, and probably one of the earliest institutes in the developing world. And one thing that we learned from you and from people like you, we take our cities very seriously. But at the same time, our cities are miserable, very badly designed, very badly run, and they are the worst form of sprawls you've seen. We've got cities that are now sprawling hundreds of miles. And in fact, the center of Pakistan is probably one big city now, stretching for hundreds of miles. And our city planners still think that creating a sprawl is the best thing in the world. And they still think that we have to have car-dependent cities. And they still think, in fact, there is a law here that bans apartments, virtually bans apartments. With great difficulty, we've got them to agree to build apartments. Otherwise, they had this thing that a single family home is a basic unit of life. And the problem is that you've got a population, young population, rapidly growing, almost at 2.5% per annum. And we are already numbering 220 plus million. And the projections are that by 2030, or I think 2030, we'll probably, I don't know when, but we'll be 350 and our steady state population will be probably 500 million, which is a scary thought. So on reading your book, Professor Bertaud, Order Without Design, I was so energized. I thought we should try and get to learn from you. I'm extremely happy that you joined us. Our topic, evolution of city shapes, is extremely welcome, and we would love to hear from you. So I should give this over to you. Alain Bertaud, everybody know, is one of the finest thinkers on city development. He is currently with the New York Institute, but New York City University, sorry. But he has been a city planner and an academic and a worldwide consultant in many places. As he says in his book, he started off as a young city planner in Algeria, if I remember right.
Yes.
He talked about how to plan cities, etc. So Alain Bertaud, as I said, has written a lot, and we really appreciate your writings. But I will not try and paraphrase you. I will let you tell your story yourself. So over to Professor Bertaud.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor. And I certainly appreciate also the audience in Pakistan. It's a country where I've worked a lot, but not recently. So it's, I worked in the master plan of Karachi in 1974, and then again in 84. And then I have visited here and there, but not so much. So let us start. I will share my screen because my background is an architect, and so I always need visual prop to make my point. The title of my talk is a little ambitious: Evolution of City Shapes, Birth of Megacities and Cluster Cities. I will try to do it as fast as I can. There's a lot of substance. So this is the way it will be organized. This is a summary of the things, the point I would like to make. Cities are shaped through spontaneous order created by labor markets. Cities are not shaped by urban planners. Urban planners, of course, or urban regulation or urban managers have, of course, an influence on the way city develop. But basically, city grow because of people who are moving there. And it's a pattern of commuting trips which are structuring cities, because cities, again, are labor market. Then I will talk about, is there a limit on the size of cities? And this is a difficult point, but I will give examples. And then I will very briefly address the post-pandemic cities. There are a lot of people who think that the pandemic will have completely changed the shape of cities. I think it will have an influence, but I don't think it will change it so much. And then finally, I will complete my talk with what I call urban fads versus urban trends. You know, cities develop in a certain way, we have to monitor them, but there are also a lot of urban fads which distract us from the real problem. And I will finish very quickly, actually, on the role of planners. So, cities are shaped through spontaneous order created by labor market. Basically, people go to cities uh, to find a job. And so they are attracted to city because of the people they can see there, you know, they can meet there. Uh, so that's what I call a spontaneous order. You know, even in the most let's say you know muscular commanding economy like we had in the Soviet Union or China at the time of Mao, the government could not control really the shape of cities, you know, although they were permitted to move to a city. So cities are shaped in most of the world by households and firms who are coming to the city because they feel this is the best place for them to live. And of course, cities compete with each other all the time. And households and firms interact through the labor market. You know, households have to find a job in order to survive in cities, and firms, in order also to survive, have to find employees and consumers. So the cities, the real estate market are created by this access to job and amenities. This is what established the price. Now, interestingly enough, in spite of all the problem that very large city create, and I would say the complexity of management of very large cities, empirical data are showing that the larger is a city, especially when they have an integrated labor market, the more productive and innovative they are. You know, I found that, for instance, in cities like Bangkok or Jakarta, which are, we feel paralyzed by congestion. If you look at you know, the domestic product of the city, you find that it's much higher than anywhere else in the country. So it shows that, again, this agglomeration, this possibility of people to meet, to have face-to-face contact, are in fact creating wealth and innovation and productivity. So this, you know, urban economists have also, of course, analyzed that since maybe 100 years now. They talk about economy of scale, spillover effect, and I will add the possibility of random face-to-face contact between people with diverse skills and experience. This is something, by the way, that so far conversation on Zoom cannot really provide. You know, our conversation on Zoom are not random. You know, we have a selected number of people, and my interaction with you will be relatively limited. You know, if I was in Islamabad right now among you, after the talk, we could meet in a conference room or maybe in a restaurant, and then there will be some random contacts, random face-to-face contact, which I think will be, in a way, probably more useful than my talk today. And again, this is what the city provide. Oh, sorry, I have a problem. I have a problem moving my, yeah, here it is. So here's the largest urban agglomeration in the world in 2021. And so you have on top of it Tokyo, Yokohama, Jakarta, Delhi, Manila. You know, the way, by the way, the population is counted might be controversial sometime, you know, but basically it represents something real. And because I have been in this field for more than 50 years now, I could tell you that 50 years ago, most countries have a policy to limit the size of the largest cities. And this policy failed. It failed because in a way, it's quite contradicting what I've been talking about so far, that in fact, very large city, very large labor market are so productive that it become an economic force against which government policy can do very little. And so again, here, this reinforces my point that cities are spontaneous order. You know, if you have 35 million people in Jakarta, it's not because 20 years ago or 30 years ago, planners say, oh, let us have a city of 35 million people. They were trying to restrict it and to encourage the growth of in other islands, by the way, outside of Java. And I could say the same of Seoul, for instance. I worked in Seoul, in Korea, 20 years ago, and the country was desperate to stop the growth of Seoul and try to develop smaller cities. It didn't work. We could say the same for, all the cities of India. Here you have Delhi, Calcutta. There was a very strong, and so here again, it reinforces this idea that cities are made by people who move to them. Now, if you look here, I have a sample of 12 cities, the density profile of 12 cities. Horizontally, I have the distance between the city center and the periphery from 0 to 30 kilometers. And vertically, I have the densities in people per hectare from 0 to 350 people per hectares. And you see that all those cities have nothing to do with each other, in culture, climate, economy, tradition, or whatever. But all of them are following a density gradient, which have been analyzed by urban economists. It's called the standard urban model, which says that in fact densities from the city center, from the CBD, decrease following an exponential, negatively sloped exponential curve. All of them have this thing. What it means to me as a planner, it means that in fact there is no optimum density for cities, that some part of the city are very dense and others in the periphery are less dense. I will show in the latest trend that in fact even this concept is disappearing in the most recent development. But it's a useful thing to know that a city survived precisely because of the large difference in densities and land price. The high densities are created by high land price. There is no point in having low density if you don't have high land price. So let us look now, when this city is organized that way, let us look at the pattern of commuting trips because they are structuring cities. Again, my point of view is that cities are before labor markets. The time spent commuting from residence to place of work is a tax on productivity. The longer it is, the more difficult it is, the more tiring and uncomfortable it is, the more the people who work there suffer, and therefore that will affect also their productivity and their quality of life. So reducing commuting time is the most important thing that a planner can do. That means developing transport system and which are adapted to the density pattern which exists. So the advantage of mobility, creating a better mobility, increasing mobility, is for household, it increases access to the number of potential jobs. If you live in a large city, like say Karachi, if you have a transport system which works well, you have access to 5 million jobs. If your transport system doesn't work well, you have access from your house to maybe 100,000 jobs, and that will reduce your welfare. If it will increase your welfare if you have access to larger number of jobs, and it's the same for the employers. A firm moving to Karachi or Islamabad or Lahore move there because they want to have access to very specialized people, and so they want to draw their employee from the entire population of those large cities. Now, let us look on this graph on what are the commuting patterns. Well, on the left, the more traditional model is what's called the classic monocentric model, that basically most of the jobs and amenities are concentrating in the center, and so there are people living in the center at high densities, and then as density decrease, they move to the suburb, but so they have to move from the suburbs to the center. And so you see here the traffic pattern is usually, you have dispersed origin but concentrated destination. And this is relatively easy then to deal with transit, rapid transit, rail, subways, or public transport. Although you will have, of course, also some people who will commute with cars. Now, again, here, before I move further, cars is a very convenient mean of transportation. It has one enormous drawback, is that it consumes a lot of real estate. And the more expensive is the real estate, the more this consumption is expensive for everybody, because, again, cars do not pay a rent on the street space it's used. Now, the next model is a dispersed model, which is found mostly in North America, where you have dispersed origin and dispersed destination because the jobs are spread all around the city. That's the case in Los Angeles or Atlanta, where practically there is a center, but it has maybe 5 or 6% of the job. There is not a very high concentration of jobs, so they are spread. So therefore, here you have dispersed destination and a dispersed origin. This is very difficult to deal with that with mass transport. And therefore, in rich country, then those cities which are organized that way rely on individual transport, either cars or motorcycle. In poorer country, then you have a substitute, which is a collective taxi. That will be the case, for instance, in a city like Mexico, where most of the trips now are done by small taxi or minibuses, which about 10 or 12 passengers, because that's the only way to cope with those dispersed destination and dispersed origin. And then finally, on the right, you have the most common model, which is in fact the superposition of the two other models. On one hand, you have a center with a lot of jobs and especially amenities, things like restaurant, museum, government offices, and things like that. But more and more, as the city grows, more jobs are going to move to the suburbs. And then you will have a mix of this. And you will have then, in a city like that, a lot of trips which are from suburbs to suburbs. And here, these are the type of trips that we planner have a difficulty organizing and catering with, except, again, for individual means of transport, which as soon as the city reaches a certain density, then it's become very difficult to handle. Now, I have to very briefly talk about something that I see all the time when I am asked to review master plan, is that a lot of planners think that it will be possible to organize a city like a lot of small urban villages, and that you could match jobs and housing in such a way that everybody will not have to commute long distance, but could even walk to their job. This has been the policy, for instance, promoted in Paris in the last 4 years by the mayor, that they call it the 15-minute city. Now, there is nothing wrong with a 15-minute city if you have a transit system which allow you to go from one side of the city to the other in 15 minutes. But 15-minute city based on 15 minutes walk, I think for a large metropolis is a dream and it doesn't exist in the real world. If you look at cities all around the world, no city is organized like that way. So we have, in fact, a fourth system which has been emerging in the last 20 years. It's what I call an urban cluster. And that's, it's very different from the dispersion of jobs in a city, like in the composite model in the suburbs, it's in fact several core center with very high densities and very high level of amenities, which are within commuting distance from each other. So this creates, of course, this allows an enormous concentration of people in a small area. Because you have this peak of very high densities, but you have also, again, lower densities in between. It makes the transport system extremely complex. And you have the government here has to invest enormously in several type of complementary type of transport in order to accommodate trips, within the main municipalities, but also the trips between suburbs to suburbs, which still exist. And so where do these cluster city exist? The larger one are found in Asia, and in China in particular, the Greater Bay Area, which is the Pearl River Delta, that I will discuss more in detail a little later. In India, I've identified Delhi, and I think in India, it's only cluster cities, Delhi, that I could find. Indonesia, Jabodetabek, which is Jakarta metropolitan area, is definitely now a cluster city. Japan, Tokyo, Yokohama. Now, cluster cities did emerge in Europe, or in the United States long ago. The San Francisco Bay Area is this cluster city, but it's very small compared to the city, the cluster found in Asia, or the Randstad in the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Schravenhagen, are part of that. But they are also very small. Or the Ruhr area in Germany is a cluster city, but again, the scale is very different. So what we are interested in is really this emerging very large cluster city that we find. So the Greater Bay Area in China has now a potential labor market of 86 million people. It's a larger urban cluster in the world so far. Let us look at it, more definitely. So here is what is in red here is what urbanized. So in the south here you have Hong Kong, Shenzhen here, then you have Guangzhou and Foshan here, and Macau on the other side. Now this came, I would say, spontaneously, although Shenzhen was definitely planned, but it was planned by allowing labor market to work. Shenzhen, which is in the middle of this cluster here, was in fact, Deng Xiaoping decided there to allow the labor market to work. Before in China, there were no labor market. There were a lot of labor, but no market. That means that the government assigns you for a job, and usually you stay in the same, or I think the same company all your life. Deng Xiaoping is the first who had the idea that people should be free to change job and look for job, and they should be paid according to their skills rather than according to salaries established at the central level. And that's what created Shenzhen, and what created, in my opinion, this enormous cluster. This cluster, this river delta was not really, the city was individually planned, but as a cluster, it was not planned. But in the periphery between the main cities, let's say Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, appear spontaneously in the smaller municipality, a lot of industrial area where land was much cheaper than in the center of those big cities. And that's what created really this cluster. The Chinese government had the good sense of, instead of trying to contradict this spontaneous trend, to try to manage it. And that's what created, I think, this enormous productivity. That, for instance, the Apple iPhone is designed and manufactured all over the world in a way, but it is assembled in the Pearl River Delta. And for one reason, when Apple was asked to bring back the the work in the United States, they say we do not have the supply chain that could be found there. So, these large cluster cities provide a supply chain for manufacturing, but also for engineering, which is and innovation, which is unique because again, the potential, the of 80 million people being able to communicate very quickly and exchange ideas. So this, again, I want to emphasize that this is not a very large city with a strong center and enormous suburbs. It is several cities. These are the distribution of density. It's not a very good graph, but you have the origin, the source of the graph below there. But it shows that you have very high cities or more than 300 or 400 people per hectare distributed all over the cluster. One thing which again distinguishes the cluster, this is the number of super tall buildings. That means buildings which are more than 300 meters high. And you find that it has more of this tall building in this cluster area, this Greater Bay Area. But those very tall buildings are not concentrated in one area like they would be, for instance, in New York or in Chicago, but they are in fact evenly distributed among the larger city within the cluster. You see that Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong have nearly equally number of very tall buildings. So this is, now, again, I want to emphasize the difference between this cluster city and the traditional cities. So here on the top, I have again this map of the Greater Bay Area. And below, at the same scale, I have represented the built-up area of Seoul, metropolitan area, and Paris metropolitan area. So you see that the difference between the two, they are at the same scale. The Greater Bay Area have 86 million people. Seoul there, what is represented, 25 million people, and Paris, 11 million people. So you see here the difference of scale. In the Greater Bay Area, on a square of say 150 kilometer by 150 kilometer, you have a little more than the population of Germany. The entire population of Germany fits in one urban cluster where people are able to commute from one area to another. So you see, it's very different from the pattern you find in Seoul or in Paris, where basically you have a very, very strong center with very high density in the center. Seoul, you could argue, had in fact two centers now. There is Seoul itself, the CBD of Seoul, but you have also Incheon, but it's basically still a very heavy concentration with a very large low density suburbs, where in the GBA you have some low density suburbs relatively, but you have high concentration in several very large cities. So here, if I compare to what existed in Europe, what we considered before a cluster city, we had the Randstad, in the Netherlands, and the Randstad altogether, that means Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Groningen, The Hague, Utrecht, has only 8.4 million people. It's an order of magnitude below the Greater Bay Area. If I take San Francisco Bay, the entire San Francisco Bay had let's say 10 million people. So again, it's a dwarf compared to the Greater Bay Area. And frankly, you have only high densities in the center of San Francisco. And it's not very high, by the way, the San Francisco city. But for instance, in the Silicon Valley, the densities are not very high. They are more like suburban densities all over the place. So you see here again, the Greater Bay Area is a different animal. The problem, of course, you want to integrate it as a labor market, it's not fully integrated. You know, when I talk about a labor market of 85 million people, I will say it's a potential labor market of 85 million people. So here is a transport system, but it's one measure from Hong Kong. How long does it take from Hong Kong, you know, on the map on top, to go to Shenzhen, to go to Dongguan or Guangzhou? So this was in 2010. You see the blue line here, the dark line on the top, show how far you could go in 3 hours from Hong Kong using railway system. And the red line here show how far you could go in 2010 in 1 hour. You see that it was relatively restricted. That means that the labor market was not really integrated. You could not go every day, commute to Guangzhou and have 3 hours time. You know, that will be 6 hours commuting. Now, this is in 2018. This is a difference. Still from Hong Kong, you can reach probably about half of the population of in 1 hour using transit. You can reach probably 2/3 of the population in 2 hours, and in 3 hours you can reach practically the entire population of 80 million. So you see, we are not there yet. Problems are not yet solved because you know, to go from station to station is fine, but you have to go to your firm. Your firm is not necessarily close to a station. So you will have to have and the Chinese are working on that, by the way. You will have a rather complex system of transport, you know, to go from the station to your ultimate destination and from your house to the station too, which will have to be a smaller type of, you know, and I think that what you will have is this type of little gizmo, which you could park in your house or could pick you up at your house and bring you to a station where you will have a rapid train, which will give you access to other part of the city. But again, with the idea that you will have very high concentration of job along different cities, not just dispersed as they are, for instance, in the suburb of New York. So the labor market in the GB is still fragmented, huh? And so it will be really fully productive when you could go from in 1 hour from one side of the GBA to another side in less than 1 hour. And at this point, if they manage, if you know, the planners, the manager of the GBA manage to invest in transport this way, and then they will have probably the most productive city in the world by far. Now, there is no reason why other city cannot imitate them in, you know, in especially in Asia, which has still a lot of potential of urbanization. So is there a limit to the size of city? Well, I think the limit is really the transport technology. Many cities have, for instance, if I take the Mexico City, which has 22 million people now, it's a city I know well. You do not have a market of 20 million people, you know, a labor market, well, of active people. That will be 15 million people probably. You do not have that because the transport system has collapsed practically. And they have a subway system which works well, but not to the point that you can serve that. So in fact, you have an overlapping smaller market, probably of 5 million jobs, you know, and they are overlapping. So they have a higher productivity than cities of 5 million people because those labor market are, but they are still not very as efficient as they could be if the transport system could serve them well. And again, the transport system have to be reinvented. You know, if you have such a large city of 50 million people or even 25 million people, you cannot just blow up the existing, you know, subway system or bus system of a city of 2 or 3 million, you have to reinvent a system of transport which probably combine different mode of transport within one trip. And that require a lot of coordination and thinking. So the important thing for planner is to increase mobility, and they have to manage public space, including roads, pricing roads, seeing how road space is allocated to different type of vehicle or walking. When I would say that most roads are mismanaged. When I see that vehicles, are private vehicles are parked permanently on the road system of large city, I think this is a complete misallocation of the road space. A private vehicle should be parked on private parkings and pay the price for it. The road system should not be used as a parking lot. It should be used to move around, again, to increase the mobility. And again, it's a top-down design, whether it's a municipality which has to decide how much of this road space has to be allocated to sidewalk, how much to bicycle, how much to motorcycle, how much to car, how much to buses, and if possible, of course, add to this road space by having tunnels and subway system. But again, this is has to be top down, and it has to be adapted to the structure of the city. As Professor Nadeem Haque introduced us, was if you have very low density suburbs, it will be very difficult to link them really with a very efficient transport system. Now, let me move a bit here. So post-pandemic city, will the city after the pandemic will be very different? Well, there has been an hypothesis about 1 or 2 years ago that, everybody could work at home online, and therefore, nobody is linked to a city anymore, that cities as labor market are obsolete concept, that I could move to a small village or even in the desert somewhere, and if I have a connection with internet, then I could work from there. If this is true, if this was true, then the entire world will be a huge labor market, integrated labor market. And then there will be no need for cities anymore. We could. Now, the reality is not that. First, that a lot of jobs cannot be done from home. And then even the jobs which can be done from home, for instance, say, university teaching or education, theoretically, you could teach any class from home or through the internet. In reality, what you expect in a university or even in a primary school classroom is face-to-face interaction and random face-to-face interaction with other people. This is where the big ideas come from. And this is, I think, is not going to disappear. I have here a graph which shows in the New York, New Jersey, the metropolitan New York, metropolitan region of New York. Horizontally, I have a graph here which represents the percent which have an ability to telework, and it's by sector. And vertically, I have the average annual earning, from $0 to $300,000 a year. And the size of the bubbles are proportional to the number of workers in each sector of the economy. So you see that the large majority of people, in fact, are working in area where they have very little ability to telework. Some have, but not 100%. The people who can work, remote are relatively high-income people, and they represent probably about 25 to 30%. This is the ability to telework. It doesn't mean that at the end they want to telework or that their employer wants them to telework. That means to work remote. So this is what I think we will see, is that you will have a a change in commuting pattern. Some people will go to the office maybe 2 or 3 times a week, not more, maybe once a week. And but we will still need this face-to-face contact. And then there is a large majority of people who have work, like for instance, people who work in hospital. You know, you cannot have a nurse or a doctor working online only. They have at a certain time to see you. If you have to have an X-ray, you have to have an X-ray person who, you know, do the X-ray, and they cannot work from home. So if you have a restaurant, of course, you don't work from home. We during the pandemic we saw a new category of people where you know, they were called in the United States indispensable people, and those indispensable people for the life of the cities were not the top professor or the top doctors or the top engineers. They were the people who were delivering food, you know, by truck, with people who were putting food on the shelf of supermarket, or people in the warehouses were shipping products, you know, to be shipped to the people who could not move because of the pandemic. So this is what you know, we have to acknowledge that in a city you have a large range of jobs and with different income, but all of them in the long run are indispensable. In the short run, the indispensable one are the one that we saw during the pandemic, the people who deliver things or manufacturing things. In the long run, of course, you need also the innovative people. So we are all indispensable workers, and we have to meet, I think, face to face in order to stay productive. So let us now very quickly look at what I call urban fad and urban trends and the role of urban planners. So what I call fad, you know, sustainable, resilient, livable, smart city are desirable attributes. And I completely agree that cities should be sustainable, resilient, livable, and smart. My problem with planners have been that they just, I would say, name whatever they do, resilient or sustainable, without giving any evidence, you know, quantitative evidence that they are. So I call that fad because it's a way out. You know, whatever I do, I say, you see, this is smart or this is resilient. And I baptize that, I give a name to what I do. But this is not serious, you know, so this is a fad. If you can develop really measurable indicators, and you can see that, you can prove that if you do that, you will say reduce, for instance, commuting time, or you will reduce congestion, then this becomes serious. It's not a fad anymore. But if it's only a, you know, a line that you use, it's not. The 15-minute walk city that has been developed in Paris by the mayor and the planners of Paris in the last 5 years, to me is a fad because, you know, it. By the way, Paris is a 15 minutes walk city if you can, you know, if you consider walking to a restaurant or a bakery. You know, they are bakery within 15 minutes walk because of the density of Paris municipality. But for jobs, you know, people who move to Paris are not looking necessarily for a job within 15-minute walk from their house. And there is no planners who can assemble job and housing in such a way that you can find jobs within 15 minutes. The control of the use of small space this is another fad, by small adjacent community. For instance, I see a trend, especially in Europe, but sometime in the United States too, where community decide that they will decide what to do in the street next to them. Now, a street is a public good, and that to me is a privatization of public good. Now, I'm not saying that some streets should not be pedestrian. Maybe it's a good idea in commercial area to have some pedestrian streets, but a street is basically a public good, which is part of a wide network which serve the entire city. You cannot just close it because you feel that it will be quieter in your apartment if there are no cars in your or no buses in your street. And then finally, I have seen something which disturbed me a lot, what I call the city as a club med. People imagining that, you know, people come to city just to be entertained. And I will give an example of that in New York. This is a project for 21st Street in Manhattan by a very reputable consulting firm who have done a lot of master plan all over the world, by the way. And that's what they propose for 21st Street, but not only 21st Street, practically 70% of the street of Manhattan. This is the way they see. Now, you know, this is not a city as a labor market. This is a city as a club med, you know, so that's very attractive, but this is the reality. This is 21st Street in Manhattan. By the way, you see that to make this perspective, they slightly enlarge the street. But this is the way it is now. Now, I agree with you that it's a complete mess and that probably it should be redesigned. The use of the street should be redesigned. But the solution is not that. The solution is, when do you deliver freight like that? You know, when, you know, is the car the best way to move around Manhattan? You know, what will be, should a vehicle be parked the entire day on the side of the sidewalk? Probably not. So this is really the real problem. Let us look now at urban trend. So megacity of 50 million people, I think, are going to emerge in some part of the world. I look at, you know, on Google image of Pakistan to see the latest thing, and I see large cities like Karachi or Lahore are still in a way what I call the composite city, that there is a very dense urban core and then suburbs which become lower and lower density and become larger and larger. And so they are not really cluster city. How could they transform themselves in cluster city, which will again solve a bit the problem that was mentioned in the introduction about, you know, having large suburb of very low densities. That's while preserving, by the way, some low densities in some area of the city. But so I am not so sure how this will emerge. The other trend that I can see is that we are going to have a falling demography in Europe, Japan, Korea, and soon in China, and possibly in the US if they don't, you know, if they don't keep their the welcoming immigrants as they used to do in the history of the US. So migration from poor country toward richer country are, I think, going to be very important and going to be the key. You know, if you see a city like Copenhagen, for instance, it's what I call a well-oiled machine. It has, you know, it's very well managed, but the population is going to decrease, especially the active population. So in order to maintain their welfare, they will have to have a larger, you know, maintain a proportion of active population. And they can do that only if they welcome immigrants from other countries, which have cities now which are not well-oiled machines. And I think that migration then should be considered for rich country as part of, you know, of an urban strategy. Let us look now quickly. Now, I think I'm out of time. This is what's happening in Japan now. You know, it's and even it's worse even now. That was in 2010. Here on the graph, I have the size of city from 1 million to 15 million, and vertically I have the rate of growth. The horizontal line in the middle is zero growth. That means all the cities which are below this line in the middle are negative growth. You see that only few large cities are still growing in Japan. All the cities, practically all the cities, from 0 to 5 million, have a negative rate of growth. That means that the people there are aging. And I visited some of those cities recently, And I realized that they are very well managed. They are doing their utmost to manage this loss of population, but it's something planners don't know what to do, how to do it. Uh, some years ago, I was working as a consultant in Moscow about 10 years ago, and just looking at the zoning plan of St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I was asked my colleagues in the planning department, we have to close 50 cities. Do you have any idea how to do it? I said, no. All my life, I work in cities which were growing, and the problem was to accommodate growth. I have no idea how to close a city. And that's what is happening now in Russia, and it's going to happen, I think, in more and more rich countries in the world, that because of the falling demography. So I will close here because with this only, this is Pakistan and this is Germany, and this is what I'm talking about. This is the age pyramid. You see, below you have the young people, and as you go, the aging people. So when you have city like, if I take Germany, on the left there, you have cities which are losing their active population and have a larger amount of people in the older age who needs to be helped, who are not active. This is a loss for the labor market. So how do you deal with that? The only way to deal with that is by immigration, and not immigration from the countryside of Germany, but immigration from part of the world which have a larger. Now here, if I look at Pakistan, I see that the pyramid is becoming kind of like cylindrical in the bottom, and if they could maintain this cylindrical shape, then I think they can manage very well, because they could have not, they could have a labor market which would be stable, not one which is shrinking. And I think that again depends on the fertility of women, and it's something which is cultural. I will not deal with that. This is China versus the United States. You see, United States, because of immigration, has managed to maintain a rather constant rate of active population. It may change. The latest during the Trump presidency, there was an enormous, let's say, rejection of immigration. And I hope that this will stop, but I am not sure. And China has another problem also, and a problem which is very similar to Germany in a way, or Japan, is that they start losing a lot of active population. And this was due to the one-child policy, of course. And it's a bit of a double whammy, because if you look closely to the pyramid, they have in fact a larger number of male than female in the younger generation. And that, what is important is the fertility of women. It's not the fertility of men. So if you have less female, then you will have even a loss of population, which will be more important. So thank you very much indeed. This is my book for, and I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, Alain. Thank you. That was very nice, very well done. I really appreciate it. Let me just ask you a quick question before I bring in the rest of the audience. Explain to me, what is the role of city planning? I speak as an economist. We economists learned that planning was not our forte. We tried to do planning in the 40s and 50s.
Yes.
And we learned that we failed miserably, and Soviet Union is a big example of that. But similarly, we planned everywhere. The World Bank began a planning decade in the 50s, 60s. India led the way. And we've been planning our economy. We also tried it for 2 decades. But unfortunately, the results were not quite clear for 2 reasons. Many people have written about it. One is that we could not foresee the future. And whatever we foresaw in the future turned out to be wrong. And the second was that we could not tell people what to do. As some physicists said, that atoms don't talk back. We can tell atoms what to do, but we can't tell people what to do. So what is the role of city planning? We are very confused in Pakistan about city planning because we think city planning is building Legoland. It's going to tell
Yes.
me where to live, what to do, etc. And we've been building those cities. Chief among them is the city you must have seen, is Doxiada's famous city,
Yes.
Islamabad, from which I was speaking to you. So can you
Yes.
please speak to that?
Well, yes, I think that the problem is that on one hand, you have economists, and economists are aware that they know the past, but they don't know the future. So they try to extrapolate a bit by the past, but they know that economists are aware that there are shocks which are coming, like say, shock on the price of energy, for instance. Shocks in, could be a war or they, epidemics is a shock. And they want to put flexibility to adjust to change. Planners, unfortunately, and I am one of them, and most of us have a background as architect or engineers, and we think that we have to design for the future, and we know the future. We don't know the future. We have our own preference. For instance, personally, I like density. That's why I live in New York and not in Houston. But as a planner, I should not project my own preference on an entire city. And so you see, this is why I started by saying a city is a spontaneous order. The way people vote with their feet and they move to a city or another because of their preference. Even, when at the time of the Soviet Union, in order to move from one city to another or from the countryside to a city, you had to have a visa, literally, which was called a propiska, the Soviet called it that. And in China, you still have the hukou, which is normally permit of residency in a city. Well, neither Mao or the Soviet Union could really control the size of city in spite of that. You see, so I think that planners have to get used to the idea that they do not control the private part of the city. My problem is that they try to control the private part, and this is exactly the Doxiadis thing, where you have in advance exactly where the school will be, where the individual houses or walk-up apartment will be. It's done all in advance. I think that what planners should do is suddenly separate what is private from what is public, but concentrate their effort on the proper use of what is public. Because what is public is not, you have no market indicators. In a private lot, the price tell you and indicators how many people want to move there. And then you can adjust densities depending on the price. But on a road, as the road is not priced usually, or it's priced in such a primitive way that, so it's a top-down thing. You have to design it. And how do you allocate a road space between, again, transit, individual trucks, for instance? You have also, by the way, freight. I didn't talk about freight. Freight is very important in the city. How do you allocate the space for freight, for roads, for buses? This is, I think, the major work of a planner. And the planner is to monitor what the private sector is doing. Remove, there might be externalities. For instance, you have to put regulation on the private sector for anything which has to do with fire or sanitation. The way you connect a building to a sewer system, for instance, it should not be drawn by market. It should be a norm and things like that. That's clear. But, the height of a building, I think, should be decided by market unless you are close to an airport or some monument you want to protect. That's different, but something explicit. So you see, in a way, the planners have put all their effort in the wrong part of the city. They have not taken in, they want to design a city in advance like if it was a finished product. The way when I design a building for a client, a house, it's a finished product. And I want to be as detailed as possible. But a city is not a finished product. A city is constantly evolving, and we don't know the future. And so we have to be able to face the future. So again, when I see cities like New York, where the planners decide what is the size of bathroom and how wide should be a door in a bathroom, but they let cars park in the street permanently on the public street all year round. I think this is a complete misallocation of effort. The effort should have been to manage the street space, to provide transport in a very high density city, when I talk about Manhattan, for instance, rather, and certainly allowing people to park their private car in the middle of a public space permanently all year round is a complete misallocation of effort. So I'm not sure if I'm clear.
No, you did. You did. Let me just sort of add a corollary to that question. What we see here let me step back. Let's say a mature city like New York, a city like Berlin or something. Would you advocate making new master plans for it, or should there be like urban regeneration plans in select areas or whatever? What we are doing in Pakistan, we're kind of stuck with master plans.
Yes.
And we are building master plans like there's no tomorrow.
Yes.
Foreign consultants come in, they make a ton of money.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we're left with a mess because, for example, I'll give you an example. The court decided that because of a master plan in Islamabad, they would remove all private developments and houses or whatever, because Doxiadis's plan did not take into account, he built a plan for 200,000 people. We have about 3 million people here now. People means no schools, no this, no that. So all that thing has mushroomed. So the court said, no, Doxiadis plan said that, so throw all these guys out. We've created turmoil in the city. And this is happening everywhere, that we are married to the master plan. We make new master plans, we get married to them, and master plan cannot plan for the future. And therefore, we are stuck in a conundrum. So
I completely agree with you. I think master plan should be abolished. And I know what I'm talking about because, I work on the master plan of Karachi, in 74 and again 10 years later. And I think that's, master plan again is the idea that you are that a city is a big building, and the more detailed it is in advance, the better it is. And after you are if you are a contractor and you have a blueprint for a building, you have better follow the blueprint, and you cannot say, oh, I'm going to change this room, thing like that. Now, a city is not a building. A city is an enormous economic entity which is changing constantly all the time. And you do not have one client in a city. You have millions of clients. So you do not know in advance so instead, I will replace completely master plan by establishing. By the way, I completely agree with you with the consultant thing, although I didn't make a bundle of money when I work on Karachi, but
you should do it now. You should do it now.
But the consulting, but the consulting firm are doing a lot of money. In my book, for instance, I criticize the master plan of Hanoi, which is a complete waste of money, which has costed the Vietnamese millions of dollars, completely useless, even I would say negative. For the same reason as you are talking about. So, you should establish in the municipality itself, or in the entity managing the metropolitan area, a body which monitor what is happening, but monitor it constantly, not monitor it once every 10 years and then leave it saying, well, we have collected it, that's it. But monitor it. So, for instance, monitoring prices. Prices tell you a lot of things. Sometimes they are distorted, but prices tell you a lot of things. Rents tell you a lot of things. Number of cars. The time it takes to go from one part of the city to another. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? And so you develop indicators based on that. And within the municipality, if you want a consultant for a few days to do certain things, do it, but not a big firm, just on a very, very specific problem, maybe how to run traffic lights. There are people who have invented that. You can say, well, but not a master plan where you have hundreds of generalists who are, going to design their dream city on your back. And then you tell the politician, because after all, the politicians are the one who are taking the decision, and you tell this with this data, you can tell politician, if your priority is environment, or the priority is a slum, or priority is housing affordability, or priority is number of jobs, with these indicators, this is the way you could manage it, because on the city, the way it is. And then you monitor that. So you have a strategy, you monitor the indicators. If the indicators after you start your strategy are not going in the right direction, then change the strategy. This is what a private firm is doing. Apple, for instance, is not, drawing a master plan for a cell phone, an iPhone that they will sell 10 years from now. They see the way, the type of phone which are successful now, and they change as they go. And the city should do exactly the same thing. So reinforce really the planning of the city, but the planning by monitoring data, the existing data. This is, by the way, what Mayor Bloomberg did when he was mayor. When he was first mayor, Bloomberg was used to use data in his investment, and then he says, you want me to take decision and I don't know anything about the thing. So that's why he tried to develop, in the city. But I noticed that now you have a lot of cities which have very elaborate GIS, global information system, which are very good, but very few planners know how to use them. And they don't use them. They still try to design their excuse me. They try to design their own their dream cities. So that's a problem. This is a long answer to your question, but
No, great, very good question.
it's at the basis of my book, actually. This problem is exactly the basis of my book.
Exactly, I get that. But let me raise another question, which I think is also very important for us. The relationship of the car to the city. We are now trying to manage the car. Each city, for example, Islamabad, Doxiad is a city.
Yes.
Doxiad, the city was made for the car.
Yes.
He actually designed it for the car.
Yes.
The city is a linear city with no city center. The
Yes.
city is now stretched for 20 miles one way.
Yes.
And it's expanding only linearly.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that we are busy building, because as congestion increases, we build a flyover and an underpass. There are 3 flyovers being made in Islamabad today. Yet there are no parking charges anywhere. There is no congestion.
No parking charges. No
parking.
Yes,
No parking. We consider that paying for parking is an insult or whatever. And the authority also believes that there should be no. We've just tried to get them to. We've done a study for them and trying to convince them to put in parking charges.
Yes.
But more importantly, the city planners think that the cars must move at some incredible speed, like 60 miles per hour. They're building signal-free corridors, which are elongated runways, roundabouts. And they're building flyovers as if there's no tomorrow. They're building interchanges in the middle of the city. And next thing now they say, okay, for public transport, we'll build a metro bus system. But the metro bus system must be on a platform to allow the car to go from below. So what happens is the metro bus system is very expensive. I think it's cost us $2 billion in Lahore. And Islamabad has cost us another $1 billion. So instead of putting buses on the street, we want to put buses on platforms to ensure that cars are going. So how do you see the role of the car in the city?
If you have a city which historically, like a city like Houston or Dallas Fort Worth, which have which can expand, have a very low density, where historically, then you could probably manage a city like that. But in Asia, where you have much higher densities, and much higher land prices, by the way, a car basically, and I illustrate that in my book. A car is a fantastic tool for moving around. If nobody else has a car, or very few people have car. But as soon as more people have cars, you are consuming. When you move, you consume real estate. And you consume this public space. And if you don't pay for it, then you will, as economists, we know if you don't pay for something, you consume an infinite amount of this good. And at the same time, it doesn't work. It's a bit like, if you had a cinema and the owner of the cinema decide not to price the ticket and say everybody can come in and it's free, you will see the movie, but you will have 5 people sitting on your knees when you see the movie, so you will not be able to enjoy the movie very much. And a city street, I like it like that. So you have to pay for this real estate when it is scarce. And because you cannot ban cars from cities, by the way. There are some jobs where you need a car and you need freight. A city needs maintenance, so you need plumbers, you need electricians, you need doctors, you need nurses who move around, who cannot take public transport, cannot take. So you need freight and you need some. But you have to price it in such a way or allocate it, for instance, deliveries. Should you have for freight? Should you have for, say, restaurant or shop, hours for delivery? The curb space of a street should be for delivery or for boarding or alighting from a car, but not, parking should be absolutely banned for public streets. It's a misallocation. In a way, if I park my car, and by the way, in Manhattan, there are still many streets of Manhattan where parking is free. So when I park my car in Manhattan, I'm taking 20 square meters of the most expensive land in the world, probably among the most expensive world. And it's free. I'm a freeloader, on something which belongs to the public. So I get an enormous subsidy because I have a car. If I have no cars, I do not get this subsidy. So it's absurd. So how to demonstrate that? It's a bit, but we have to move into pricing vehicles. A vehicle move in a street is consuming space. Probably if all the cars were self-driving cars, autonomous cars, and if the technology was ready to move, then they could consume much less space. That will solve the problem a bit. But they will have to pay rent. You have to pay rent a bit in the same way as if you if you go to a cinema, when you pay your ticket, you pay the rent for your armchair. And if there are a lot of people who want to see the movie, then the rent is much higher.
What about flyovers and underpasses and those interchanges? How do you see them?
Well, they consume a lot of real estate too. And of course capital, they are very expensive. And the idea that you could move in a city in Asia, let's say you could have all the people commute using a car is a mistake. In the long run, it's not possible because density, say in Hong Kong, the income are pretty high, but 90% of people are taking transit, because there's not enough space in the street, for cars. So it's not a question even of income. It's a question of tradition of densities. And Asia, if I look at Lahore or the center of Rawalpindi, there's a tradition of relatively high densities, or Karachi, and you find that all over Asia. I found that in my own country, in France. We have if you look at Paris, Paris has a density, Paris municipality, of 250 people per hectare. You could not survive in Paris if everybody was commuting with a car. It will not be possible. So you have to have a way to acknowledge that in high density cities, a large proportion of the people will have to use transit.
Right.
Unless your land is very cheap, You have no, that's, Texas, the land is very cheap. Agriculture is rather, not very high yield. Uh, you have mostly cattle and things like that. So you can expand cities ad infinitum, and people have the money for cars. So you could think of individual means of transport in Texas which are viable. This is not true in Europe. This is not true in any country that I know of Asia, except possibly Saudi Arabia. But in country that the subcontinent, the density as such, even in rural area, the density are high.
Let me bring in some people from the floor. Anuparna, is Anuparna there? I think he left. Anuparna has left. Okay, then let's go. Salman Shah. Salman Shah, go ahead. This is our former Minister for Finance, Salman Shah. Go ahead. Salman Shah, can you hear me? Salman, you have to unmute yourself. Okay, Shaf. Okay, Anuparna, go ahead.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, Alain. It was a very interesting talk, and the questions that Nadeem sir is asking are also very relevant. Seem to be relevant because I'm from an Asian country, from India. My thing was that where the countries have cities that are very overpopulated, and you get even a square kilometer of land which is green space, greenfield land.
Yes.
The first idea would be to earmark and reserve as many public spaces as possible, as much land as possible for the public spaces. And that is where all the planners start, the mind starts ticking. So yes, I completely agree that it becomes my dream for the city in the garb of me being a planner and knowing the best way of dealing with the city, which may not be true, which is not true most of the times. But once a public land is lost, public space is lost, one cannot regain it because land is a limited resource.
I agree, yes. But that's why it's very important at the beginning, when a city expands, that the urban planner put a limit on the areas which should be preserved in advance. For instance, along rivers or along nalas. If you have a lake, if you have a hill maybe, or even a historical monument, put a perimeter around those in advance, and then it should be fixed. That's the market should have nothing to do with it.
And then leave it at that. Okay.
And leave it at that.
Yeah.
But after that, the idea that, by the way, every city should have 20 square meter or 50 square meter of green space per inhabitant, I don't quite believe in that, because it depends how this public space is designed. For instance, say green belt, for instance, are not usually very accessible. If they are counted as green space, they are not accessible from people. If you look at Mumbai, for instance, there is a large amount, in the island of Mumbai, there is a large amount of open space, which is jungle actually, which is very nice, but it is not an open space which is usable. What is usable or open space is the area around the shore. That's So the design is everything. If you look at Hong Kong again, Hong Kong has some very nice parks which are very small, but they are extremely well designed. If you go there, you see they are fully used even at night, and they have big trees. So it's a question of design really, and taking opportunity. Definitely anything which is next to the sea, next to a river or a nala, should be left open, and very strict about that. There is no. So that's clear. So that's a way to solve it.
Okay.
Yeah, we basically can't afford to have create spaces in the garb of saying that these are public spaces and they're not utilized. I mean, one can't afford that.
Yes. And design is very important. In my book, I don't treat design, unfortunately, because the book is already long enough. But design is very important. For instance, if I look at Brasilia, what they count as open space, they are completely useless. Open space are between highways. You know, you don't want
Who goes there?
to go
Yeah.
between three highways, and this is not an open space that you can use.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not a question of number of square meter per person. It's a question of
Yeah.
design and where they are located.
Yeah.
Thanks.
It can't just
Salman
serve the
Shah.
purpose of percentage. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank,
Salman Shah.
thank you, Nadeem. This was a fascinating talk. And I think it's one thing which I get from the gist of this is that mobility is the key to a growing city, particularly an economic city.
Yes, absolutely.
And if mobility creates value, then I mean that land value increases because of mobility. And therefore, the question which Nadeem was talking about, flyovers and flyways, which increases mobility and it opens up areas of the city which didn't have that kind of fast mobility, it creates a lot of value. So are we kind of the objective function is maximizing the value of the city's real estate or the city's space?
No, I think that here you are, in a way, I think you are mixing supply and demand. If you have a constraint on supply, you have a huge demand and a constraint on supply. So the flyover, in a way, increases the supply of land accessible by cars, by the way, not necessarily otherwise. But they do not meet yet the demand. So then it increases the value. Imagine that you have a city, like it's a case, by the way, in the city of Texas, when you have a mechanism to finance infrastructure in advance of development, so that the supply of land keep growing at the same time as the population grow. You know, if the population grow, the number of jobs grow in your city faster than the supply of land. And again, here we get back to Doxiadis' plan that Professor Nadeem Haque mentioned. If you have a zoning which imply that everybody has a lot with an individual house and you cannot build something else, then you are in fact imposing a large consumption of land on everybody. And of course, the people who, you have people who cannot afford it, then they will be in slums in very high densities and without infrastructure. Or you will have to subsidize their housing. So you see here, you have to have you could imagine, let's say infrastructure does not necessarily increase the value of land if the infrastructure go at the same time of demand. You could have, well, developed land, of course, is more valuable than undeveloped land, but increasing mobility do not in itself increase the value of land unless you have an unmet demand. That's why, for instance, say in New York, some planners think that if they increase the floor ratio, that means the height of building in one area, they create densities. They create density that way only because there is an unmet demand. If you, increase density, you have a plan to increase density in the desert, it will not create a skyscraper. It will. So you see, this unmet demand is very important to understand, and we are always. So again, getting back to those flyovers, I don't know the latest one in Islamabad, but or Pindi, but my guess is that they are mostly directed to people who commute, who can own a car, and that means that in fact you expand the city for people who, for a relatively small group of people who own a car, and who are going to consume a large amount of public space because of their car. it's not, you have to consider that even street space it's unpriced real estate, but it's real estate. And it's a subsidy, in fact, that you are giving to people who use it. So
Yeah, if I can interject, my
yes,
point would be that you have seen cities like Karachi and Lahore where the urban density is pretty high, but
yeah,
mobility is very, very low.
yes,
And
yes,
so I mean, the population is also very large. And
yes,
if by making these flyovers, and of course, it can also be public transport or whatever increases the mobility, it increases the value of the land. And that value is much more than the cost of that infrastructure. Then wouldn't that be a good indicator that we should make that infrastructure?
yes, absolutely. But yes, absolutely. If you have if land is unaffordable, it means that you are not developing enough land.
Mhm. Yeah, but the old city is limited. I mean, you can't create
No, that
new area.
you have to expand, and especially, I mean, I'm thinking of Lahore. You have also a lot of historical building, so you don't want to build a tower next to
Right.
historical
Yeah,
parts.
but
You have to protect. So, or then, of course, uh, one of the solution might be again the cluster city. But to create a cluster city, you need an administrative structure. I'm not sure that it will be possible. I mean, the only cluster city I know in the subcontinent is Delhi, but Delhi is not very successful. By the way, the transport system is not very good. Although they have expanded the subway thing like that, but it's not good. But it has grown spontaneously as a cluster city, maybe because of the fragmentation, especially of the administrative boundary of Delhi. The three states around it. I don't know.
There's one thing I might interject here too. There's
Yeah.
one thing that we are doing, which is very important, is that by building flyovers, we are not improving the value of the real estate, as my friend Salman is saying, because where the flyover goes, it's destroying real estate value as it goes by. It's destroying
Yes.
real estate value. Secondly, it's ensuring nobody can use the pedestrian space. Thirdly, curb space is gone. Fourthly, bicycling is gone. So we have cities that we cannot even, for example, now for pedestrian crossing, because we are doing this, for pedestrian crossing, we are building overhead crossing. So
Yes.
somebody has to climb 3 stories.
Yes, right.
Imagine an
Yes.
old man or an old woman or
Right.
somebody climbing 3 stories and coming
Yeah,
up.
you fragment. The problem with this again, depending the way it's designed, you in fact fragment cities. You fragment the labor market for people who are not using the cars, because you create boundaries. This is the difference between Haussmann in Paris and you know, and the flyovers. Haussmann in Paris designed street, but he financed the street by the value generated next to those streets. So the street has to be friendly to the people who are next to it. They have to increase the value. If you put a flyover, you decrease the value on both sides of the flyover normally, because of the nuisance of the noise and the thing like that. So you have to take into account when you draw a new axis, the value that you see. If you compare Robert Moses in New York to Haussmann in Paris, Robert Moses tried to develop highways through New York, which would have completely destroyed Manhattan. Because it will have fragmented Manhattan in the individual little pieces, which will not have survived. There's again, it's a fragmentation of labor market. And don't forget, as you say, in a medium income city, the labor market is done of people who are bicycling or using scooters or walking even. I mean, in Mumbai, 25% of the workers are just walking to work. So if you put obstacle in their displacement, you are fragmenting the labor market of the poorest, which is even worse. So it's a, you know, these are complex ideas. I'm not sure I can communicate
Oh,
as
but these are
well.
very important ideas.
But,
Thank you very much.
Okay, Nadeem, can I just
Ji,
ask one
Go
supplementary
ahead,
question that
sir.
to me it seems what Alain is saying is that we need to have some pretty good financial modeling of the city in terms of value creation and mobility and development and regeneration. And that should really help us determine the kind of infrastructure that would be needed.
absolutely. And monitor, have indicators which monitor the price of land and the rents in the different area which are developed, you know, including, by the way, in the Doxiadis area and things like that. You will learn a lot if you know, again, not to average for the entire city or for a large district, but having a relatively detailed, you know, monitoring of land prices and things like that, and you will see the impact of, you know, developing the infrastructure when the infrastructure is necessary and provide wealth, and when it's in fact decrease welfare.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shaf, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I just like to say it was actually a great lecture where, I personally had a lot to learn. And, particularly your comment about how the focus on regulating private land more than regulating the public land, I think that kind of summarizes the problem that I think our city planning is facing here. But there are just two things that I'd like you to comment a bit more on. The first one being that as a planner, how do yourself try to incorporate while planning about a city or some place, the common places, like the importance of that in planning? Because uh, if I see across the development that we have seen of our cities, it's a lot of concrete blocks and not many playgrounds and not many parks and not many common spaces for people. So I think, how do you see the importance of those common places in city planning and all? And the second one, I think one idea that you shared, and if I understood that correctly, was regarding, reallocating jobs to different suburban areas close to those places where, people employed in those jobs are living. But, how I see, and I would like you to comment on that, is don't you think with number one, how, right now we have multiple people from a single household working in different places. And secondly, also about how people keep on changing jobs and all. Don't you think that would be a slightly inefficient way of allocating jobs in suburban areas, and maybe more preference should be given to increasing mobility across cities so that people could move around the city while living where it's feasible for them, and while jobs being
Yes.
located where it's
So
feasible for them?
your last point, I think, is very important. I specifically advocate increasing mobility. I think that job disperse naturally in cities. No planners can allocate job. You cannot force a firm to move to a suburbs unless you subsidize it. And even if you subsidize it, probably they will take the land, but they will not create a job there. So I think that firms have to select where they want to go. And again, if you monitor very carefully the firm choice, you may be able to know where a certain firm want to go, and you may design maybe the infrastructure so that a firm will want to go there. But you cannot certainly match jobs and residents, because the choice of a residence is personal to a household. Some household want to be, I don't know, next to their mother-in-law, for instance. And then after that, when they are there, they will try to find a job in the city. So you cannot match that. That's a dream of planners which do not exist. This is what they pretend to do in Paris. It doesn't work. You see, for instance, we have the example in Seoul. In Seoul, when they realized that they could not stop the growth of Seoul, they decided to build satellite town around Seoul. They built 5 of them, to my knowledge now, and they were very they were very well planned. They were very successful. They were very eager when they developed those satellite towns to match the number of jobs with the number of people who were going to live there. And when those things were built, and they were well built and well connected to the city, they found that the people who had jobs in those satellite towns were in fact commuting from the rest of Seoul. They were not living in the town. And the people who were living in the town were commuting to the rest of Seoul. So this idea of developing a suburb which is in autarky, which is self-contained, is a myth of urban planner. You know, it's something they believe in but doesn't exist in reality. Again, try to imagine if you build a satellite town and you want to attract a firm, who is going to move there? It's going to be a firm which wants to expand, which probably is in the city, wants to expand on cheaper land. So it's a firm which already has its own worker. So they are going to move to this new city, new suburb, but their workers are not going to change job. They are going then to commute to the new location of the factory or the office. The same way for somebody, you create housing in those new satellite town. Who is going to move there? It's going to be somebody who already have a job and decide that they live maybe in a small apartment in the center, and if they move to the suburb in this new town, they can move in a better apartment. But they also have a job, because if they don't have a job, they cannot buy an apartment. So they are not going to change job and apartment at the same time. They are going. So this is why you have this conundrum of a new suburb, let's say satellite town, where people commute. And there's nothing you can do about it. All you can do is what you mentioned, is to improve mobility. So from those satellite suburbs, you can move easily to the rest of the city. But you cannot conceive them as self-contained. And again, that was a bit, sometimes the idea in Doxia, they think that those communities were self-contained, you know, that with their own shopping center and things like that. That's not the way cities work.
Thank you, Professor Alain. This was really wonderful. I can tell you, your book was just as eye-opening as Jane Jacobs when I read that.
Thank you very much. That's a very nice compliment.
Books, it's absolutely wonderful. Sort of lit bulbs in my head, and I began to see things very clearly. I hope you can help us rid us of the consultants in the master planning. It's tying us in knots.
Yes.
Tying us in knots. Let me tell you one of the things they do. For example, we have regulations saying that in my city, Lahore, which is a city of 28 million people,
yes,
until a few years ago, I had a hard time changing this regulation. The height of a building was 38 feet. You still can't build more than 2 stories.
Yes,
if you're building a new development, the rules are that 65% has to, sorry, I forget now. I'll tell you, something like 35% is roads and 2% is commercial space. 2%.
Yes, yes.
2% is public space, which includes schools and offices, etc. And 2% is graveyards. We have this kind of planning.
Yeah, this is absurd. You know, it's a rigidity which prevents any type of evolution. I mean, it's like, it's an incredible rigidity, which, you know, practically, or then it creates, I think, corruption, because you cannot do something which makes sense there. So you'll have to probably bribe people to ignore it, or count something as cemetery, which is not cemetery, or something like that. So it's very destructive of city, this type of attitude.
It gets much worse because of 2% rule, there are no school spaces available. So most of the schools are made in houses that are converted to schools. With the result, there are no playgrounds, there are no dedicated spaces, nothing. And you as a designer can think, you know, how can you make a school in a single family home and expect it to give the children the same kind of amenities or consciousness that they get in a dedicated school space. So I'm just telling you, for example, another thing, urban planners, thanks to urban planners, we haven't had shopping malls till 10 years ago.
Yeah.
They banned shopping malls. Even today, there is no office space in our cities because they say that office space is commercial and it should be in a separate area from housing, and that you can either choose between shopping and,
Yes, right.
office
Yeah.
space. So we are hamstrung in many ways. Our cities are destroyed, and I don't know how we can change it. So thank you very much. Your voice comes as a breath of fresh air.
Thank you so much.
We hope that you'll join us again sometime. We won't bother you much, but we'll bother you
With
from
great
time to
pleasure.
time.
With great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting
Thank
me.
you,
It
Alain.
was a
Thank
great
you,
pleasure.
Alain. This was wonderful. We really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.